A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay. A new episode every single day. Episode 14-2, River of Shadows Part 2. The slate-gray dawn arrived without a sun, choked by the massive, greasy plumes of oily black soot drifting from the torched lower valley blockhouses. Beneath the suffocating blanket of barbarian smoke, the funeral column resumed its grueling, mechanical crawl toward Aegae. General Parmenion slipped back into the margin of the highway by ear alone. He had abandoned his mare 3 miles back in the blind limestone gorges, her lungs ruined by the fine white granite dust triggered by the midnight rock slides. Now on foot, his dark leather cuirass violently scored across the left ribs, and caked in a thick drying smear of foreign blood, the strategist looked less like a general and more like a phantom sculpted from the alpine bedrock. He moved through the gray fog flanking the baggage train, his boots catching the exact cadence of the marching levies, to remain unnoticed by Ptolemy's estate scouts. His face and beard were white with pulverized stone, his throat raw from the caustic mixture of slate dust and burnt winter wheat. As the column ground past a dense cluster of river reeds where the Haliacmon current roared in the blind mist, Parmenion's sandal caught on a taut piece of braided hemp. He froze mid-stride. His unblinking eyes dropped. The cord was pinned to the earth by a heavy, iron-headed Boeotian tent peg, driven deep into the river soil without a single marking of stone strike. It was a structural perimeter marker, perfectly spaced at 12 paces from the water's edge, the geometric blueprint of a foreign deployment. Parmenion did not draw his blade. Instead, he subtly shifted his weight, his fingers dropping to the worn pommel of his short sword as his eyes pierced the shifting gray vapors of the marsh grass. 3 paces away, the reeds didn't sway with the alpine draft. They shifted against it. A motionless figure detached itself from the mud, wrapped in a dirt-colored Boeotian felt cloak that completely absorbed the dull, filtered orange glare of the burning frontier. Beneath the heavy brim of a low-slung, blackened iron helmet, a pair of cold, clinical eyes locked directly onto the Macedonian general. It was a Proscopus, one of Pelopidas's elite scouts. He didn't raise a spear, he merely held a short, iron-tipped measuring rod across his knee, his posture completely devoid of the panic currently tearing the lowland camp to pieces. The 2 veterans stared at each other through the swirling soot. The silence between them was an absolute geostrategic audit. "You are outside your diplomatic alignment," Greek Parmenion whispered, his voice a flat, gravelly rasp that stayed below the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the nearby marching phalanx. The Theban scout didn't blink. He lowered the measuring rod slightly, his register dropping into an unyielding, rhythmic frequency that carried the cold arrogance of Leuctra. "The alignment shifted when the mountain went to war, General. We aren't outside our lines. We are merely drawing the new ones." Parmenion's jaw set, the white granite dust cracking on his cheek. He looked past the scout's shoulder, tracking the invisible geometry of the river loop. He didn't need to see the southern highway to know the truth. Ismenias's advance unit hadn't slept through the midnight panic. They had eaten the road while the Macedonians were still screaming at the ridge fires. The iron hammer of the south wasn't coming to mediate. It was already closing its jaws over the crossroads. "Tell Ismenias that a cage built on burning sand doesn't hold native iron," Parmenion murmured coldly. "The cage isn't for the iron Macedonian," the scout countered, his figure already dissolving back into the gray ink of the river mist. "It's for the birds inside the tents." Parmenion did not waste a second breath. He broke the gaze, stepping over the hemp cord, and veered astride directly into the magistrate column ahead to locate Antipater, before the head of the procession breached the bone-white gates of Aegae. Parmenion detached himself from the shadow of a passing baggage wagon, his leather sandals catching the precise mechanical rhythm of the magistrate column. He fell into stride exactly 1 pace behind Antipater. The elder statesman did not turn his head. His gaze remained anchored straight ahead, peering through the gray, greasy fog that hung low over the limestone highway. His right hand remained buried within the heavy folds of his woolen mantle, his thumbs slowly tracing the bronze rim of his hidden ledger tablet. "You smell of limestone slurry and foreign blood," General, Antipater said, his voice a flat, gravelly friction that didn't alter its cadence by a micro-negative second. "I require the metrics of the western throat, not a display of dynamic butchery." "The western passes are empty," Antipater, Parmenion reported, his breathing shallow, his throat raw from the caustic mix of slate dust and burnt thatch. I choked the lower shelf with 200 tons of winter granite at midnight. It bought us 12 hours. 14 if Bardalus's light horse gets mired in the western marsh. Antipater's thumbs stopped against the bronze rim. Then the western flank is secure until the pyre is lit. No, Parmenion countered coldly, wiping a smear of gray, sweat-soaked ash from his temple. The tactical victory was poisoned before the dust hit the floor. Bardalus didn't even blink at the rockslide. He simply pushed his light skirmishers through the high crags. But that isn't the vice that will snap our windpipe before midday. Parmenion leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into a low, freezing register of absolute logic that stayed well below the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the nearby marching phalanx. I just crossed a braided hemp perimeter cord 12 paces from the river loop. Pinned by a Boeotian iron tent peg. For the first time since the march resumed, Antipater's left eyelid twitched. He didn't break his stride, but his massive shoulders grew noticeably rigid beneath his mantle. Pelopidas. His advance unit under Ismenias has already mapped our entire encampment layout, Parmenion stated, his eyes scanning the terrified noble heirs trailing behind young Attalus on the margins. They aren't here to offer superficial expressions of mourning for Alexander II. While our enlistees were dead drunk or screaming at Bardalus's ridge fires, the Thebans were executing a procedural audit of our density. They logged our panic bottlenecks, measured the depth of our baggage train, and verified that Ptolemy's left flank is a defenseless void. Antipater's mind, always operating like a clinical ledger, instantly calculated the geostrategic alignment. The crossroads at the base of the foothills. Exactly, Parmenion area-analyzed, his register thin and sharp. Ismenias's advance unit hasn't slept through the midnight panic. His frontline hoplites have eaten the highway, while we were staring at the mountain fires. By the time Ptolemy's advance scouts clear their morning mists at the southern crossroads, they won't find an open road to Aegae. They will find 300 iron spears already locked across their windpipe. A senior magistrate a few paces ahead turned his head anxiously, trying to peer through the swirling soot toward a fresh column of black smoke mushrooming against the gray sky. Antipater instantly stepped into the man's line of sight, his heavy frame blocking Parmenion from view. The core infantry cannot pivot to meet them, Antipater stated flatly, his internal monologue remaining steady despite the tightening vice. The levies are staring at the smoke from their own estates. Attalus is toxifying the campfires, telling the boys that Ptolemy's Athenian credit lines leave their mothers naked to the mountain wolf. If the phalanx attempts to break the sacred custom of the funeral crawl to strike the Greeks, the army will mutiny and hand Ptolemy's head to Bardalus to buy back their fields. Then the regent is already a prisoner who hasn't seen his bars yet, Parmenion muttered, his hand tightening on the worn pommel of his short sword. He just dispatched his final wave of couriers to the coast to force an Athenian naval intervention. He's running out of air. Let him suffocate, Antipater concluded, his voice dropping into a clinical finality that brooked no debate. We breached the gates of Aegae by midday. Old Attalus has locked the bottlenecks with the old guard. Save your breath for the climb, General. When the torch hits the cedar tomorrow, we will find out if this realm is ruled by the ledger, or if we must drown the valley in our own blood to wash the throne clean. Without another word, Parmenion subtly veered astride into the shifting gray vapors of the margin, dissolving back into the gray, protective ink of the Macedonian dawn. As the funeral column crawled forward, the atmosphere shifted into a claustrophobic, waking nightmare under the low-hanging, greasy black smoke of the Illyrian fires. Inside the curtain litter, Eurydice sat rigid, her posture more like a blade of tempered steel than a grieving mother. She kept a protective, proprietary hand resting on Philip's forearm, steadying a young man whose composure was becoming as unnerving as her own. Philip's eyes, visible through the fine gaps in the linen, did not blink as he tracked the black soot painting the horizon. He was observing the military formation, his mind clearly measuring the distance between the Macedonian baggage train and the encroaching shadows on the ridge. Beside them, Euryno's knuckles were bone-white where she gripped the carriage frame, her breath catching whenever the litter jolted against the rutted, gore-slicked road. The air within the cabin had grown brittle, heavy with the silent tectonic collision of three lives realizing that by the time this column stopped moving, their world would either be ashes or an altar. "They are destroying the lower valley," Euryno whispered, her throat dry from the acrid air. The lowlanders are weeping on the road because they think the gods have abandoned the Argead line. The gods do not manage frontiers, Eurydice countered coldly, her voice low enough to be buried by the heavy crunch of the wheels outside. She looked from Philip to the silhouettes of her sons, Perdiccas and Philip, who walked in the grid outside. Let the valleys burn today. It only serves to illuminate the failure of the Regent. It makes the iron we forge tonight hit harder. The grand machinery of the Regency sat paralyzed. Ptolemy of Aloros and his senior generals were trapped inside a prison of their own design, too legally bound by the unyielding customs of the Ekphora to act. To detach the heavy phalanxes or launch a counterstrike before Alexander II was safely sealed within the earth would risk turning the superstitious army against the throne. Look at the western ridge, Regent, Perdiccas shouted, his voice cracking from the smoky dust as he kept his stride beside his brother's hearse. That is the lower valley outpost. My father built those blockhouses himself. They are burning our borders, and we are doing nothing but walking. Prowling along the columns on his mount, Ptolemy did not turn his head. His face was a grim, calcified mask beneath his high-crested helmet, though his knuckles were white where he gripped his horse's reins. We are satisfying the ancestors, youth, the Regent rumbled back, his deep voice carrying a sharp, dangerous edge. A king who cannot endure the sight of his own borders burning, while he secures his legitimacy, is a king who will never live to rebuild them. Keep your eyes on the road ahead. But beneath his flawless display of state protection, Ptolemy's internal calculus was fracturing. The barbarian's smoke was a clock, counting down the precious hours he had left before the mercenaries realized his Athenian credit lines were a world away, and the kingdom they were weeping over was already becoming a ghost. Young Attalus immediately weaponized the devastation, riding the extreme margins of the highway like a herdsman driving a fractured flock. His 80 elite lowland foot retainers marched in a tight, aggressive block around his horse, their polished bronze targets catching the dull, filtered orange glare of the burning frontier. Throughout the grueling morning hours, he constantly veered his mount toward the younger, hot-blooded heirs of the primary Upper Macedonian aristocratic bloodlines, using the terror of Bardalus's fires to dissolve what little faith remained in the central government. Look to the hills, boy, Lord Attalus murmured, his voice a low, mocking friction that cut cleanly through the rhythmic, heavy crunch of leather sandals in the limestone grit. He raised his gold-knobbed riding whip, pointing it directly at a massive, greasy plume of black smoke, billowing from a torched Elymaic granary on the lower terraces. Do you smell that? That isn't the sacred incense of the priests. That is the winter wheat of your own estates, turning to ash while you break your knees in the dirt for a corpse. The young noble from Elymia, his face crusted with gray salt and raw from the smoky draft, pulled his mount closer, his knuckles wide on his spear shaft. The Regent's heralds swear the Chalcidian mercenaries are holding the line at the river mouth Attalus. They say Ptolemy is stabilizing the board. Ptolemy is stabilizing his own purse, you fool, Attalus hissed back, a sharp, dangerous smile cutting across his face as the poison took root. Look at the horizon. Ptolemy's foreign banking alliances and his precious Athenian credit lines cannot put out those fires. The gold of the south cannot buy back a burnt village, and a merchant's ledger cannot stop an Illyrian axe from splitting your mother's roof. The Regent has left your ancestral homes naked to the mountain wolf, while his private estate guards protect his ledger chests in the baggage rear. The young aristocrats exchanged sharp, volatile glances through the swirling gray fog, their fear instantly transforming into a dark domestic fury. Let the smoke choke them until they can taste the failure of Pella, Attalus calculated internally, his hand tightening on his reins as he guided his mount back into a predatory loop around the officer cadre. By the time we breach the final gates of Aegae, these boy lords won't be weeping for the dead king. They will be looking at Ptolemy's purple cloak, wondering how much native lowland iron it takes to cut a slave string from the south. For the Regent, the orange glare painting the western mountain crests was a physical subtraction from his life expectancy. Astride his great black warhorse at the absolute head of the paralyzed crawl, Ptolemy of Aloros watched the distant peaks ignite with a clinical, freezing clarity. His timeline had just been cut in half. He knew the precise, volatile anatomy of a mercenary army. Soldiers who fought for coin would dissolve like salt in a summer rain if they believed they were being led into a blind mountain trap by a commander who could not protect his own borders. Fear was a contagious rot, and if he could not project an unshakable, terrifying display of complete administrative control before the first crow of the cock, his 1,200 spears would belong to whoever offered them a way out of the valley. This was the hidden catalyst that transformed his demeanor as the slate-gray dawn of the second day broke. His mask of state protection did not slip. It became deliberately, suffocatingly aggressive. Every command he issued to the marshals carried the heavy friction of an ultimatum, his booming register pitched to drown out the distant, crackling murmur of the burning frontier outposts. But beneath the polished bronze of his muscle cuirass, his inner pulse was thumping like an unyielding drum. He weaponized the chaos of a brief halt near a sacred boundary stone to subtly wheel his stallion toward the dark margins of the baggage train. Waiting there in the gray fog were his 3 final coastal couriers, their mounts kept fresh on hidden supply strings. "You ride for the Thermaic Gulf," Ptolemy hissed, leaning down from his saddle, his features calcified into a ruthless defensive mask as he slipped 3 sealed vellum rolls into the lead rider's leather pouch. "Avoid the low road. Pausanias's Chalcidians are already slitting throats along the coastal redoubts. If these mandates do not reach the Athenian naval agent before the moon turns, the credit defaults." The courier blinked through the stinging gray soot that hung low over the highway. "And if the Athenian fleet has already pulled back from the docks, Regent? The rumors of the king killing have likely reached the south by now. Then you buy the vanguard captain with whatever timber rights are left on the Pierian slopes," Ptolemy commanded, his register dropping into a clinical, freezing register that brooked no debate. "If Athens defaults, the mercenaries turn their spears on my own tent before the pyre is lit. Go." With a silent, urgent nod, the riders detached themselves from the train, dissolving instantly into the shimmering, smoky heat mirage of the valley floor. Ptolemy guided his stallion back to the head of the line, his unblinking eyes locked on the jagged, burning silhouette of the hills ahead. By mid-morning, the grease-thick blanket of barbarians soot hung so low over the southern crossroads that the limestone highway resembled a dry riverbed choked with ash. The rhythmic, agonizing crunch of 5,000 leather sandals in the grit slowed, then hitched, then died entirely. At the absolute head of the paralyzed crawl, Ptolemy of Aloros reined in his great black stallion. Behind him, the monumental hearse of King Alexander II groaned to a halt, its 12 horse teams tossing their foam-flecked heads in the acrid gray fog. Philip did not stay within the ceremonial spacing of the royal family. Stepping out of the heavy wheel ruts, his sandals crunching softly on the limestone verge, he slipped past the rigid, iron-faced hetero guards to reach the front ranks of the advanced scout cadre. His slate-gray pupils did not look toward the burning western peaks, nor did they watch the sweat-drenched nobleman behind him frantically murmuring prayers. His focus was anchored entirely to the geometric intersection, where the mountain trails met the lowland core. 300 heavy hoplites of the Boeotian elite, the vanguard of Ismenias's personal retinue, stood locked across the entire 60-foot width of the highway, in an absolute unyielding density. They had built no barricades, yet they were an unassailable fortress. Their 3-foot brass aspis shields were overlapped rim to rim, creating a continuous glittering scales of bronze barrier that completely severed the road to Aegae. Above the brass rims, a forest of 9-foot ash spears rose in a flawless, bristling grid, slanted forward at a clinical, uniform 45-degree angle that left 0 entry points for a charging horse. These were not the main phalanxes of Pelopidas, which remained held in strategic reserve beyond the horizon. These were the chosen instruments of Ismenias, the shadow architect of the Theban intervention. They stood with a terrifying, rhythmic stillness, their breathing synchronized, their eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the funeral column they had been sent to escort. They did not march as conquerors, nor as guests. They acted as a clinical, military barrier, forcing the Macedonian column to grind to a halt before their wall of bronze. Ismenias stood slightly ahead of the formation, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his xiphis, his presence serving as the silent, geopolitical ultimatum that turned the funeral of a king into a display of Theban dominance. By interposing his elite guard between the Macedonian military and the necropolis, he had effectively stripped the Argead region of the power to command his own royal rights. The funeral, which Ptolemy intended to use to solidify his own reign, was now being guarded by the very men who would eventually decide the fate of the boy heirs. Ptolemy's lead scout, his mount rearing in panic as its nostrils caught the foreign scent of Boeotian olive oil and oiled leather, screamed through the fog. "Yield the transit!" This is the Ichthyor of the Argead house. By the sacred custom of the realm, the brass wall did not shift. Not a single shield clinked. From the shadow of the central infantry block, Ismenias stepped forward into a sharp laceration of filtered sunlight. He wore no mourning mantle. His muscle cuirass was polished to a mirror sheen, and his high-crested helmet cast a long, predatory shadow across his features. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The silence of his 300 veterans carried the weight of the Leuctra slaughter. The sacred custom of Macedon ends where the safety of the south begins, Regent Ismenias stated, his voice a deep mathematical baritone that resonated through the freezing stillness of the bottleneck. He looked past the screaming scouts, his eyes locking directly onto Ptolemy's calcified mask. "King Bartolus holds the high crags. Pausanias has breached your eastern maritime gate. You are marching a dead king into a three-sided slaughter, and the Boeotian League does not permit its neighbors to dissolve into a barbarian playground." Beside the hearse, Philip watched the interaction with a terrifying, statuesque detachment. While his brother Perdiccas gripped his ceremonial sword hilt with trembling fingers, Philip's inner mind was instantly logging the absolute mathematics of the Theban geometry. He didn't see a barrier, he saw an equation. He measured the precise spacing of the hoplite feet, how each man's left flank was completely sheltered by the projecting rim of his partner's shield. He noted the depth of the file, 8 shields deep, a human engine engineered to exert a continuous, crushing forward pressure that text-based tactics could never convey. His fingertips pressed against the small oak citadel bond hidden beneath his salt-stained tunic, his mind processing the ultimate realization. Ptolemy thought he was buying a shield with his paper treaties. He did not see that Pelopidas's advance unit under Ismenias had just used the smoke to turn the crossroads into a checkpoint, and the regency was now under foreign occupation. "This is a sacrilege." Ptolemy roared from his saddle, his knuckles white where he gripped his reins, though his generals did not dare order the lowland levies to draw iron against the victors of Sparta. "We are within our sovereign territory." "You are within a vice, Ptolemy," Ismenias countered coldly, his iron-ringed staff pointing directly toward the boy prince on the highway margin. "Thebes will secure your borders, but the security of Pella requires a sovereign guarantee. The boy Philip departs with our vanguard for the south before the sun hits its meridian." Philip met the commander's unblinking gaze through the swirling soot. His face carried no fear, no submission. As the lowlanders behind him dissolved into a chaotic, whispering panic, the 14-year-old prince stepped forward into the shadow of the brass wall, his jaw setting into an unyielding alloy of mountain iron and lowland calculation. He wasn't entering captivity, he was entering the schoolhouse. Miles ahead of the paralyzed funeral procession, the sacred city of Aegae sat completely isolated beneath the same oppressive, starless sky. But on the high limestone ramparts overlooking the valley, old General Attalus had not closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Clad in the archaic, heavy bronze panoply of a veteran who had bled for Amyntas III long before Ptolemy of Aloros ever learned to hold a sword, he stood like a gargoyle carved directly from the bedrock of the necropolis. His duty was the absolute preservation of the ancestral tombs. The Ichthyor was crawling toward him, but until the dead king was physically within his gates, Attalus viewed everything beyond the walls of Aegae as a hostile variable. When the clock struck midnight and the jagged black spine of the western mountains suddenly erupted into a roaring 1,000-foot wall of barbarian fire, the sentries along the Aegae parapets instinctively reached for their war horns, their voices breaking in panic. "Hold the brass!" Attalus barked, his voice a gravelly, concussive crack that instantly severed the rising hysteria. His weathered hand slammed down on the limestone crenellation, his gray eyes narrowing as they mapped the orange glow painting the distant clouds. "Do not sound a general alarm. Those are not Macedonian signal fires." Amyntas, his veteran third commander, surged up the stone stairwell, his face pale beneath the crest of his helmet. "General, the western peaks are burning." "Is it a lowland mutiny? Has the army turned on the regent?" "An army does not light the peaks to signal a mutiny, Amyntas. They light the tents," Attalus countered coldly, his inner thoughts operating with the freezing, unyielding logic of a man who had survived a dozen border wars. He did not look at the fires with terror. He looked at them as mathematical coordinates. That is the signature of the Illyrian wolf. King Bartolus is lighting the high crags to build a cage. He's paralyzing the funeral column in the dark. Let Ptolemy choke on the ash of his own hubris, Attalus calculated silently, his jaw locking as he stared out into the pitch-black valley, knowing the young Argead princes were trapped somewhere out there in the dark. The regent thought his Athenian ledgers and Chalcidian mercenaries had bought him a smooth coronation. He forgot that the mountain doesn't give a damn about a southern coin. Bartolus will use the dark to strip the army of its courage, and by dawn the procession will be marching under a blanket of terror. Do we ride out, General? Amyntas pressed, his hand tied on his sword hilt. If we detach the old guard, we can punch a corridor through the lower foothills and escort the royal hearse the rest of the way. We can pull the princes out of the trap. Attalus turned slowly, the heavy brass rings of his armor clinking in the cold draft. His eyes were completely devoid of sentiment. We do not detach a single spear, the old commander stated flatly, his register dropping into an absolute clinical finality. If we leave the gates of Aegae undefended to play hero in the dark, Pausanias or Ptolemy's own estate agents will slip in behind us and seize the treasury and the tombs. A king can be replaced, Amyntas. The bloodline can be rebuilt. But if the ancestral vault falls, the dynasty ceases to exist. Our orders are written in the stone of these graves, not in the dirt of the highway. He pointed his iron-ringed staff down into the narrow, stone-walled gullet of the main entrance path that led into the royal burial chambers. Lock the city, Attalus commanded, the predatory edge of a cornered lion returning to his voice. I want the heavy iron bar dropped across the outer gates. Deploy the first and second sentries of the old guard into the choke points. No man sleeps tonight. When the sun rises, Bartolus's fires are going to push a desperate, terrified, and highly volatile army directly toward our walls. And when they arrive, I want Ptolemy of Aloros to look up and see that the ghosts of Aegae are guarded by men who do not bow to regents. Throughout the agonizing hours after midnight, while the lowland camp dissolved into panic and Queen Mother Eurydice bartered for her son's life in the dark, old General Attalus systematically transformed the sacred city from a place of mourning into an unassailable fortress. When the slate-gray dawn finally broke, casting that massive, greasy blanket of barbarian smoke over the entire valley, Attalus was already standing at the absolute center of the threshold. His veterans locked into a flawless wall of overlapping bronze shields behind him. He was ready for the fire, ready for the wolves, and ready to meet the regent's advance scouts with the cold, unyielding iron of the old world. The chessboard was bleeding, and the mountain had officially declared war. To be continued in Episode 15, Threshold of the Great Ancestor. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below. The dynamic has shattered across the field, with Felina and her sons joining the immediate breakout from the camp under the fire blind. The royal lineage is scattering right as Ismenias locks down the crossroads. If you were advising the young King Perdiccas III at this precise crossroad checkpoint, would you try to shatter Ismenias' lines with raw lowland iron? Or rely on old General Attalus to keep the ancestral bastion locked tight until the pyre is lit? Drop your tactical theories below.